downtrodden, rise up. If you don't mind adding a little detail, by all means. I'm Fred Weston. I'm a leading member of the Revolutionary Communist International, and this is the Communism Autocomplete interview.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism. Stronger, more determined than ever.
Communist.
Communism. 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 Communist.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what?
And welcome, comrades. I'm Joe Assad, and this is the Spectre of Communism. And this week we're doing something a little bit different. We've had a few suggestions via social media, people writing into the website, that it would be good to hear some questions from people who don't consider themselves to be communists yet, people who might have a variety of opinions about communism, who might not understand what communism is, what it stands for, what we actually believe. And we were thinking about how we could actually do this, and I thought, you know what, what's the most broad and popular forum I can possibly use to canvass some questions? So I went to Google, and I used the autocomplete function to generate the most popular questions people are searching online when it comes to communism. And we're very lucky to have Fred with us again to answer some of these questions from his expert's perspective. So, question one: what do communists believe?
What do we believe? What do we stand for? We stand for the abolition of class society. We stand for publicly owned means of production, planned under the control of the workers themselves, and that what they produce is for the benefit of the whole of society collectively. The word believe, to me, sort of implies you have a belief in something without any scientific proof or any real material basis to it, but it's you believe this because you assume certain things, or you have prejudice about certain things. You know, communists believe this and communists believe that. That's not what it's about. It's not a religion. It's about an understanding of the world from a class point of view, first of all. We think in terms of the interests of the working class, of working people, people who have to work to live, to earn a wage. And we look at it from the point of view, where did this society come from? How did we get to where we are as a society? And where are we going? Now that implies several aspects. One, a thorough study of history, not just the recorded history of society, but going further back than that, you know, archaeological, etc. Even genetic studies these days give us a lot of information about the past. To get a much longer view of historical development from the very, very early forms of the human species, let's call them, some people don't like these words, you know, the primitive humans, who, as they emerged from the animal world and started to become human, as they learnt to survive in this world, developing different techniques, developing tools, hunting techniques, the way they found their food, the way they made their shelters, as they moved around the world, understanding how that kind of society, which from everything we've seen from all the studies show that they were in effect communistic. Because what does it mean to be communistic? It means there were no lords, there were no barons, there were no ruling classes, because there couldn't be in those conditions. A small group of humans had to work in solidarity with each other and go hunting together, look out for each other. And there's no way you can go hunting and say, right, now I'm taking 90% of the hunt, you guys can eat what's left.
Wouldn't be a very popular hunter.
Well, next time you wouldn't be part of the hunt, would you? There's a material basis to the communistic way of living of early humans. And that has been shown many times over by anthropological studies. How do we get from that to the society we live in today, where it is a case that people work together in, say, a big factory? Some of them get just the basic wage, and a large chunk of the wealth they produce is taken by somebody else who's called a capitalist or the owner. There are classes, there are privileged layers of people living above the rest of society, and it's an understanding of how that happened. Now, I'm not going to go into the details here because there's lots of texts that people can read, but we understand that as humans develop their techniques, especially with the evolution of the emergence of agriculture in these different forms, started to create something which humans had not known before then, which was a surplus, an ability to actually produce more than what is necessary to keep one individual alive. When that happens, the work of one individual can actually sustain several people. So there's a surplus to his work. That's the material basis upon which a new figure can emerge in society, somebody who starts to appropriate that surplus. And you start to get these elites within society, which can only be backed up by having armed groups in their defense. The wealth is used, obviously, to pay these armed men. Like in Roman society, they would not have been able to keep the slaves in position without the Roman army. I mean, Spartacus proved that beyond any doubt. He really worried them for a long period of time.
Well, he resisted that army for quite a long time.
That's right. He took up arms against them, and if they didn't have a Roman army, the slaves would have overthrown the system. So this kind of society emerges and creates a new form of society: slavery, feudalism, capitalism. They're different ways of production, modes of production, but there's one thing in common. There's a mass of people doing the work, and there's a minority at the top that accumulates the wealth, creates an apparatus to defend their privileged position. And then this is transmitted to society as this is how it has always been, is and will always be. Therefore, give up on any idea of trying to change society. We don't agree with that. We think society has changed many times throughout history. Many different forms of society have existed, and capitalism is not the final product of historical development. Capitalism is one stage in the development of humanity, just as feudalism was a stage. It lasted something like 1,000 years, but it was a stage. Now, if you were living in the middle of feudalism, you would have probably thought this is how the world has always been and always will be. And yet one day something happened. Crowns started to fall, kings started to be removed,
and their heads removed,
and they lost their heads, some of them, and a bourgeois revolution brought into being a different system, the capitalist system. But we believe, if you want to ask what we believe, capitalism plays a role for a period, as feudalism played a role for a period, and it reaches a point where it exhausts its historical role, i.e., it can no longer take society forward. It starts actually to move in the other direction. And the world we live in today, we believe, is a confirmation of that. Here we have some of the most advanced technology that we've ever seen. Humans can do incredible things. We're discovering the solar system. We've gone beyond the solar system. We have telescopes that can see, billions of light years away. We understand so much more, and yet we have children starving to death. We have a hunger. We have poverty. We have homelessness. At the same time, we have a layer of society living in extreme luxury, based on the work of the millions of workers. If you want to ask us what we believe this cannot last forever. Occasionally, the downtrodden rise up. If you don't mind me adding a little detail,
by all means.
I was visiting Lewis over the weekend, and I went to the castle.
By the way, if those of you who are listening outside of the UK aren't aware, Lewis is a place, not a person.
Yeah, Lewis is
in this case.
It's a little town near the southern coast, not far from Brighton. There's a castle there. I visited it, and it tells you how the peasants saw the people that lived in the castle. It's actually there for the tourists to read. It says they described them as devils. Then there's another little detail, what happened during the peasants' revolt. in the 1380s. The local peasants, before moving on to London, attacked the castle, smashed everything up. To me, that brought out the hatred of the oppressed towards the oppressor. And I'm thinking, for centuries, those peasants must have felt enormous resentment towards these devils that lived in the castles, but they had no way of changing the world. They had no way of removing that. The Peasants' Revolt was one of those moments in history where those downtrodden peasants suddenly were given this chance to rise up and fight against their oppressors. And what do? They raid the local castle.
Prior to that, one of the only ways the peasants had of expressing their grievances towards their lords, if there was a famine, for example, would be to literally lie down on their land and starve to death, to lean against the wall of the castle ramparts and starve to death in protest. So you can imagine what it must have felt like to a peasant finally to rise up, to take arms in hand, and to finally try. Obviously, it was a defeated revolution, obviously it was a defeated movement, but nevertheless, to try and take some control over your life for the first time ever.
But you see, history has many moments in which we've seen this. You can go through long periods where it does seem as if nothing is happening. You know, everybody's in their place, the peasant is on the land and he does what he's told, or the workers in the factories. But there are moments in which the crisis of society brings to the surface a revolutionary fervor from below, and you see moments in which society can be radically changed. What we believe is history teaches that happens on a regular basis throughout history, and it hasn't ended. It's going to happen again and again, but this time it's going to be the workers in a capitalist society, in an industrial modern society, faced with the conditions that capitalism creates around them, you know, the growing poverty, the eating away of the value of wages, the destruction of the infrastructure, the healthcare system, education, etc., a constant increasing of the burden on the shoulders of working people, will lead at a certain point to an eruption from below, and that will be a moment in history which will give us a chance to put an end to class society and actually create a different society. It will be the beginning of a new period in human history. That's what we believe.
All right, that's a very thorough start to the autocomplete interview. Question 2. Why, Fred, do communists want to take my property? I don't mean specifically my property, I mean the royal mine.
Yeah.
Why do communists want to take people's property?
Yes, well, this is a common question which is asked as if to say, what's behind it is this: communists are lazy, no good for nothing louts. The only way they can imagine getting property is by taking away the hard-earned property of other people.
Yeah, they're envious, they're deeply jealous of the wealth and riches of the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezoses of the world, who honestly earned their massive corporations through hard graft and inheriting the occasional emerald mine.
Yeah. Well, it's actually, the truth of the matter is this: it's actually not possible to accumulate huge amounts of wealth through simply 8 hours labor a day. The only way you can accumulate wealth is actually by exploiting the labor of somebody else, the labor time of somebody else. They work for you, you pay them a certain amount, but obviously you make a profit. But the question is this: communists don't want to take people's individual property away from them. Why would I want to take somebody's house? It's ridiculous. What we're actually talking about is not the taking away of everybody's property. This is the scare. Oh, the scaremongering. Oh, they come.
They're going to take a toothbrush.
They'll take everything. No, it's private property of the means of production that we're talking about. I.e., we are talking about the big multinational corporations, the big companies that dominate. It is literally the case now that a few hundred big multinational corporations dominate the world economy. And in each country you can find several hundred companies that are responsible for a huge part of the production.
Right.
Now, what we say is that private property should be expropriated, should be made public, and should be used for the good of humanity, not the house or the back garden or the car or the stereo or whatever it is that people own individually. They're not, you see, the point is this: the private ownership of a house or a car is not the cause of the crisis.
Right.
It's the private property of the means of production, the big ones.
But also, just as a point of information, we were talking about this yesterday. Something like 86% of landlords in Britain are what are known as portfolio landlords, which
That's
means
right.
they have at least 4 properties,
That's right.
only one of which presumably they live in long term. Maybe they have a holiday home, but the rest they simply use as assets in order
That's right.
to extract wealth from other people in the form of rent.
That's right.
So the vast majority of people don't own a home. Even those who think they do, really, in most cases, the bank owns your home. That's what a mortgage is. You don't own that home. The bank
right.
owns that home. The bank owns that property, and you pay them off over the course of however many decades. And more people than that are renting. Who
Yes.
they don't even have a mortgage. They don't
That's
even
right.
have an eventual claim to the property that they live in.
We see that, take housing, one of the most important items that an ordinary working class or any working family can aspire to own is the house,
Right.
Which takes decades for most families to achieve through a mortgage, through paying
If
interest.
they ever do.
If they do. Now, you see, they say that capitalism works because it's based on private property and everybody wants property, etc. But if we look at what's happening today, families, let's say the previous generation, my parents, I remember, they started with nothing and they managed to buy themselves a house. This was at the peak of the boom. But in those days, the value of a house was actually much lower relative to wages. So working class people could actually afford to get onto the property ladder. Since then, what we've seen is precisely what you're saying. The big landlords who are grabbing the property, and in a situation where people obviously need to live somewhere, if you have control over the housing stock, you can push up the rent, and the price also has massively gone up. So in reality, a lot of people don't even have their own house as a private property. So it's funny that the capitalist class should accuse communists of wanting to take people's property in the sense of your house, when in actual fact it's the capitalists who are taking away people's small property, such as in housing. The percentage of families that can actually afford to buy their property now is going down. So it's actually the capitalists who are taking away property. If anything, as communists, we would defend the right of a working class family to hold on to its house, but we would explain it's because of the private property, i.e. this big percentage of the housing stock which is owned by big landlords, plus the ownership of the big means of production, the big corporations, the big companies, the factories, the offices, etc., which are used to maximize the profit of the small minority. That is the private property,
Right.
which we say should be eliminated, because that is the cause of the crisis that we're living in.
I just did a quick Google. Google's doing a lot of the hard work in this episode. And it turns out that in the 1970s in Britain, a home in London, on average, cost about 4 times a worker's annual wage. So this is the median income.
Yeah, that's right.
Today, it's about 14 times.
That's
So that
right.
gives some idea of the scale. I think this is the way that we can summarize the question. We can't take away what you don't have. Marx made this point. The working class is a class which owns essentially nothing. What do you own? If you're watching this episode at home, chances are you're an ordinary working person. You own the clothes on your back, you own a phone, you own maybe a car if you're lucky, you own some furniture, you own some bits and pieces that you need to carry out the essential tasks of life. These things are functionally worthless. They mean nothing in the grand scheme of things. They can't be used as investable assets. They can't be used to generate any more profit. They might as well not exist as far as the grander scheme of the economy is concerned, really speaking, you own nothing. And a tiny, tiny fraction of humanity owns essentially everything. We don't want to take your property away. I'm pointing at the screen if you're listening to the audio version. We don't want to take away your property, listener, viewer, because chances are you don't have any. We want to expropriate the property of the 1% or the 1% of 1% who control the levers of production, as we would put it.
That's right. Well, for example, in Britain, they privatized the water companies. The private owners of the water companies are making fat profits, sucking money out of the state, and we have the most polluted waters we've ever had.
Yeah, pumping literal crap into the rivers.
That's right. So there's an example of, they say, the reason the Labour government says we cannot nationalise water is they say it would cost 100 billion. The answer communists would say is, no, it wouldn't cost 100 billion. They have already made big amount of money by controlling those companies. Those companies should be publicly owned. You should expropriate them and make them public again. They don't need that. You don't pay them $100 billion. No. You expropriate them.
In subsidies, they've been paid out of the public purse many times over.
That's right.
For the value of that asset.
Many times, and they've destroyed the service.
Yes.
As a result, that's the proof that private property of the means of production, in this case, the production of clean, potable, drinkable water, doesn't work with capitalist methods.
Right, and we could say the same of the transport network, railways, about
health
infrastructure,
service, education,
we'll have to move on. But I think that the question's adequately answered, so we'll move on. Question 3. Why do communist countries have dictators? Because, of course, dictators are unheard of in capitalist countries, apparently.
Well, first of all, capitalist countries also have dictators. Hitler was a dictator, Mussolini, Franco, Pinochet. We have had many, many dictators of capitalist countries. But the reason that question gets asked is because, first of all, Russia under Stalin and Eastern Europe and other countries of that kind, first of all, they're defined by the media as communist. And then, of course, they are dictatorships. And therefore, why does communism produce dictators? Well, first of all, we have to unravel this and say they were not communist. Even they themselves didn't call their countries communist. They called them, Soviet Socialist Republics, etc. The idea was that they were building towards communism. The truth is that genuine communism is based on public ownership of the means of production, but also the management and control of those means of production by the mass of working people themselves through elected bodies, etc. In these countries, you didn't have that. You didn't have the election of the officials. You didn't have the election of the people at the top. And what you also had was a bureaucracy which had risen above society, living in privileged conditions. They were living above the conditions of the working class. It was a classic bureaucracy that emerged. The reason for that is, you can read Trotsky on the Revolution Betrayed and other texts on that. But the reason for that is that you cannot have a genuinely planned economy that works within one single country. 2, especially in a relatively backward economy where you have to build up the resources, such as in Russia after 1917. The Russian Revolution was not envisaged as a national revolution. The Bolsheviks saw it as the beginning of a world revolution. That failed because of the leaders of the social democracy in other countries that blocked that process. But once that had happened, the bureaucracy that emerged had a material condition which was different to the mass of working people. Now, in any society like that, if you had a genuine workers' democracy, the workers would have the ability to question and challenge the bureaucrats, challenge the way they managed, challenge what they were doing, challenge the fact that they were living above the conditions of the working class. And if it was a genuine democracy, they would be able to remove them and elect others who represent them. that means that inevitably, once you have a bureaucracy like that, it will move in the direction of a dictatorship. It has to be like that because any element of workers' rights would mean to the workers challenging those bureaucrats. But that would mean they would lose the privileges which go with being a bureaucrat and an official. And therefore, you have these dictatorships. But that's not communism. That we would, it's a Stalinist type dictatorship in one country after another in that part of the world. So communism does not produce dictators, but the contrary. But a degeneration of a revolution like the one we saw in Russia, in the conditions in which we saw it, eventually does produce that phenomenon.
Yeah, and I think that people should listen to our previous episode on the question of socialism in one country with Nicholas, because he goes into some of the nuts and bolts of the impossibility of achieving that and what actually emerged in the USSR and elsewhere. Next question. Why does communism not work? Doesn't get much blunter than that, but here we are. We passed it to Google, so we won't complain.
Well, you see, the capitalist system, they say, works. Well, let's look at that. Let's look around the world today. Is capitalism creating a flourishing society that's moving forward, that feels confident that things are better today than they were yesterday, and tomorrow's going to be even better? The health service is getting better all the time, education is getting better all the time. Life is wonderful, and there's no wars, there's no diseases, there's no famine, there's no climate change, there's none of that. I'm saying it like this purposely because anybody that listens to that will realize that, well, actually, capitalism doesn't work either. What capitalism does, it seems to work for certain periods, and they can last a few decades. Like, if you take Germany between 1890 and just before the First World War, seemed to be working. Standard of living of workers was going up, wages were going up. They were getting pensions, they were getting granted reforms. A similar period after the Second World War, roughly 25 years, from the end of the war to the mid-70s, the NHS was established. When I went to university, you were given a grant. You didn't come out of university with a lot of money in debt.
That must have been nice.
Yeah, you got a grant, and it was basically, you were given your independence and your education was paid for, and you came out with your degree without all the burden of debt that young people have today. So in that period, it did seem, yes, capitalism seemed to be working. Again, careful with that. It seemed to be working in some countries. Western Europe, North America, a few other places like Australia, Japan, and a few other advanced capitalist countries. In the former colonial world, in Latin America, in Africa, in large parts of Asia, it wasn't working so well. That explains actually why in that period you had so many revolutionary movements in that part of the world. So there are periods in which it seems to work, and then in certain parts of the world and for certain layers of the population. But then it goes into crisis. And when it goes into crisis, it turns into its opposite. So we would say capitalism isn't working. Now the question is this: why didn't communism work? Well, it's connected to the previous answers. It wasn't communism that failed, because communism was never achieved in these countries. You see, in capitalism, there is an element of truth in what they say. There's a kind of self-regulating mechanism, i.e., if a capitalist makes a TV which explodes when you turn it on, nobody's going to buy any more of those. And they're going to have to design a TV that does not explode.
Yeah.
So it's in his interests, that capitalist, to make things that work. When you have a bureaucracy that is interested in meeting targets and producing huge quantities of goods so they can just tick off and say target reached, and the quality is bad, there's no market to regulate it. Now, in that kind of system, the only way you can make sure there's a regulation of the quality is by having workers' democracy. I.e., if the TVs are bad, it's the workers who produce them are also the people that use them. If you have workers' democracy, they can say, just a minute, this guy has designed a really bad TV, back to the drawing board, redesign until we have something that we can use. But that would require workers' democracy. It would require workers' power, which would also mean that the guys doing this would not be living separate from the working class, above the working class, in a privileged condition. They would be under the democratic control of the workers. That would be the way to have a regulating mechanism on the quality, the quantity of goods, what we produce, how we produce it, in the interests of humanity as a whole. So communism can work. It has never actually been achieved. Now people say, so it's never been achieved, so it will never be achieved. Well, my answer to that is, actually, capitalism hasn't always existed. There was a time in which there was no such thing as capitalism. There was no such thing as bourgeois owners of the means of production.
It wasn't even that long ago in the grand scheme of things.
That's right, just a few centuries. In some parts, it only developed in the last 50, 60 years, to be honest. That consolidated its position. Now, if you'd have gone back into that period, imagine a couple of people speaking in a field under feudalism, and one says, do you know, this society we live in, where we have to work all day digging land for a pittance.
Yeah, 8 of my children have died this year.
That's right. All the disease. No, we want a society where we have factories that make tools, that produce tractors, so we don't have to dig the land. It probably would have been seen as completely utopian. What are you talking about?
What is a tractor?
That's right.
Would have been the first question, I think.
Yet capitalism came into being through revolutions. As capitalism came into being, so can the future communist society.
And the difference, of course, being that the bourgeois didn't themselves set out to create capitalism as a world system. They instinctively followed their class interests when they went to war with feudalism, with the divine right of kings, with the arbitrary power of the crown and taxation and so on, when they developed industry, developed science and techniques so that they could,
Well, the bourgeois were emerged, obviously, within the system. They needed their space within society.
Right.
They needed instruments of power to function, which came into contradiction with the way the feudal system worked.
Sure.
And therefore, even though they weren't conscious of where they were going, they were inevitably coming into conflict with the feudal aristocracy.
But the difference with socialism is that we are conscious of what we're fighting for. The difference is that the working class has ideas, it has a tradition, and it has methods of struggle, and we're in the process of trying to develop a revolutionary leadership that has a program ready-made when the movement that becomes the revolution in a given country breaks out, and knows what to do to begin the task of constructing a new form of society.
We're seeing it already. I mean, it's not the purpose here, but if you look around the world, the overthrow of the dictator in Bangladesh this year, the big movement in Kenya, the movement last year in Sri Lanka, we saw on TV screens, phone screens or whatever it is, computer screens people look at, we saw revolutions. We saw ordinary people en masse going to the presidential palace, removing the hated dictators. Why do they do that? Because life has become intolerable for them. That's the beginning of a process. The point is, of course, it's not enough to be angry and rebelling against what you have. You've got to have a clear idea of what is going to replace it. And that's where the role of communists comes in.
All right, here's a good one. Are communists atheists?
Well, if you want the short answer, is yes.
Yeah.
In the sense that...
These two communists are atheists.
Yeah. I was brought up a Catholic, but I started to realize that what they preached and what they actually did... My mother actually had an old saying, she was a peasant. She said, do what the priest tells you, do not do what the priest does. And I used to think...
That's a vote of confidence, isn't it?
That's a bit of a contradiction. Why should I listen to somebody telling me to do stuff that he's not prepared? What it meant was, be good, help the poor, etc. Abide by the the laws, abide by the rules of society, but if the priest doesn't do that because the priest is greedy and is taking more than he should do or behaving in a corrupt manner, well, don't copy what he does. It's a bit of a contradiction. But to get back to the actual question, we're materialists, i.e. we look at the material world, we analyze the world as it is, the real material that we have in front of us. We look at science, we understand how matter functions, how society moves, how history moves, and we look at all the material factors. We don't believe there's some kind of spirit outside of this world intervening and affecting the world that we live in. And we believe that if we really want to change society, it's this society that we change, not the next world. It's the power that religion has over the minds of many people is, I've heard it many times, say, yes, when we're all dead, we're all equal, etc.
True, I suppose.
It's true, we're all equally dead. But while we're alive, some lived in luxury and others lived in poverty. Now, the question comes to this: can you be a communist and not be an atheist? Well, I would say, if you're a Marxist and understand the Marxist philosophical outlook, the conclusion of the thinking is clearly that there isn't a spirit world. But you can be a worker that believes in communism, i.e. believes in a world where the wealth that's produced by working people is used collectively for the good of the whole of society. You want to fight this society that's based on privilege, on the use of wealth to strengthen the position of the wealthy and oppress the masses. You want to fight for a better world, but you still have your religious views. We, as Marxists, as revolutionary communists, would say, if a communist who has religious views and a communist that doesn't agree on the actual program we want to carry out, if they agree that the fight is to expropriate that tiny minority of capitalists, nationalize the means of production, place them under workers' control and management, and run society in a communist way, if we agree on that and we're prepared to fight together, I have no problem with a communist that says, I have these beliefs as well. I respect that. Let's fight to change this world. The next world we can always discuss under a future communist society, and we'll see where society goes on that.
Or I guess when we're both dead, maybe we'll get to discuss it then,
well,
if they're right.
Yeah, well, people have different opinions on what you can do after.
But look, I think that we also need to draw a bit of a distinction here, because we're Marxists, right? Marxism is a school of ideas, and it bases itself on the philosophical method of dialectical materialism. It's a materialist philosophy. It's an atheist philosophy, explicitly so. But communists have come from all different traditions in the course of history. We've said on this show that the early Christians, in the period where they were basically an oppressed radical Jewish sect, were communistic.
Yes.
They were, of course, religious. They were deeply religious, and they framed their communistic tendencies and their belief in liberation from Roman oppression in religious terms.
Well, the early Christians, if you joined them, you had to give over all your property.
Right, exactly.
You had to renounce your property, actually.
Yeah.
In the Acts of the Apostles, there are moments where you see there's a famous one, husband and wife join and don't give all their property.
Yeah.
And they're called to answer why. And actually God strikes them dead in that moment. Why? Because they didn't renounce all their property. It's a rather curious one. A lot of people who claim to be Christian today and will not appreciate the communists, let's say, probably don't get that highlighted in their religious studies.
No.
That the God of the early Christians would strike dead the husband and the wife because they didn't give up all their property. That is the confirmation that the early Christians were actually revolutionaries against the slaveholding system.
And they can't even entirely hide behind the New Testament, because Jesus also said that it was easier for a camel to pass through a needle's eye than for a rich man to enter heaven.
That's right.
He overturned the
that's right.
tables of the moneylenders at the temple.
It's
Anyway,
all there. But
it's
can I
all
just
there.
add something else about religion? You see, religion has changed over time. Religious views have changed. Now, Christianity, Islam, Judaism have been around for a few thousand years. Christianity, 2000. Islam, a little bit later, 1500 years or so. Judaism claims to go back 1,000 years, maybe before Christ. At the very most, we're talking about 3,000 years. Now, it's been shown by all the evidence, the archaeological, the genetic, that Homo sapiens has been around for probably around 300,000 years as a species.
Yeah.
That means that for 1% of humanity's existence, it has had one of these three major religions. Then there's Hinduism, there's Buddhism, but we're talking about this kind of period in which these religious views have existed. The further back you go, the greater the difference in religious views. You go right back to the time when people would pray to the animal they'd killed and ask its spirit to return. Or they believed that trees had a soul, mountains could think, you had to feed the mountain, etc. The further back you go, the greater differences you see, and you see an evolution. So, my view is this: if the religion is a truth, surely it should have been true for humans from day one. Instead, for a very long period of time, the religion reflected the structure of the society. As society changed, for example, from the polytheistic religions where you had many gods, as you have the rise of the state with one leader, the emperor, the king, etc., the religions also started to change accordingly and in their structure. So people who adhere to religion will see it as their truth. We as Marxists would look at it a little bit more objectively from a long view of history and see that it's a reflection of a way of thinking of a particular moment in their development. And just as religion and the attitudes of humans to religion has changed as society has changed, changing society again in the future will inevitably impact the way people view religion.
And we can go into that in more detail maybe in another episode. Basically, to summarize, Marxism is an atheist philosophy, it's an atheist school of thought, but of course there are millions of working people who are religious, who might well agree with communist ideas, who might share our perspective, and absolutely we have an open hand to all people of all beliefs and persuasions if they agree with the struggle to overthrow capitalism and win a better existence for the majority of people in this life. In that
Yes.
sense, of course, you can be a communist and hold religious views.
Let's work together to change this world,
Yeah.
whatever your view is on that question.
Nicely put. All right, well, I think we'll move on. It's another good one. Are communists nationalists?
Well,
Before we go any further, we should say that Fred is of Italian heritage, so he brings a slightly different national perspective than I do as a
Welsh.
as a Welshman.
I'm also partially Welsh. I was born in Wales. Nationalism and communism. You see, the slogan at the end of the Communist Manifesto is "Workers of the world unite." Marx pointed out that workers have no nation. And if you think about migration, well, the United States itself as a country is the product of the fact that many workers from many countries around the world, initially starting in Europe but then spreading elsewhere, the nation that they belonged to or the country they lived in had nothing to offer them in terms of work, income, or even the prospect of some kind of improvement in their lives. So they went where the work was. In effect, workers go where the work is. And if that means you leave your country, you leave it. Millions went across the United States. Millions of initially English people, followed by the Germans, the Scandinavians, then the Italians, and many other peoples, the East Europeans,
The
the
Irish.
the Russians, and then more recently, obviously, from Asia, from Africa, the Latinos from Latin America. That is a proof of the fact that the real nation of the working people is where the work is, where you can get your wages. Now, the other side of it is this. The capitalist system is a global system. No single capitalist country can function within the borders of its own countries, of the country. You know, the criticism, to go back to the discussion before, socialism in one country is not possible. But people forget that capitalism in one country is not possible either.
Right.
America, for instance, requires a world market to exist. China requires a world market because the tendency under capitalism is to overproduce, to produce more than your local market can absorb, and the only way that you can exist and function is by exporting a part of what you produce. That's one side of it. The other is no single country has all the resources that are required for a modern economy. You know, the earth didn't evolve in such a way as to make sure that in every future nation that emerged, there would be enough iron, enough silver, enough lead, enough this, that, and the other, that each country could function almost in autarky. No, the world is made the way it is. The minerals are spread around the way they are. The resources are where they are. Therefore, the only way one country can function as a capitalist country is by trading with others, getting the raw materials they require, and then exporting the final products.
Or stealing from others.
Or stealing, yes, of course, the imperialists, etc. But even that is a proof that capitalism in England could not survive within the borders of England, or Britain, or the United Kingdom, whatever you want to call it. The way it could survive, the only way it could survive was through imperialism, going out and basically dominating and literally stealing the raw materials from the peoples that were living in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere.
Go to the British Museum, and I mean, materials aside, in terms of the artistic and cultural accomplishments of these places, you can find quite a lot of them locked away in the vaults of museums here in Britain.
But going back to the question, are communist nationalists? Well, no. The answer to the immediate short answer is no. But there's always a but. It's no. If nationalism to me means I have to identify with my ruling class because I speak the same language. You know, I speak English, therefore I should identify with King Charles.
Yes, or when you speak Italian, you should identify with Giorgio Meloni.
Yeah, exactly. That's not how we would view it. If nationalism means that what comes first is the nation you belong to, i.e., I'm working class, you're middle class, he's a bourgeois, a capitalist, because we all were born in one country, we speak the language and we're citizens of that country, we have a stronger common interest because of that. We would argue no. I, as a worker, have more in common with the workers of other countries than with my own boss, my own ruling class. And the truth is this, the ruling classes, the capitalists of individual countries, have more in common with their capitalist friends in other countries. The fact that we live in the epoch of multinational corporations that operate beyond the national borders, and these corporations have an interest which is against the workers of all the individual countries. Therefore, the solution to fighting this is not a nationalist one. It cannot be that. Although there are attempts to do it. Trump, make America great again. Farage talks about Britain, etc. Meloni will talk about Italy and as a nation, as if we can solve the problems of, say, the unemployed of each country by uniting with the bosses. The bosses are actually the cause of the problems. So, in that sense, no, we're not nationalists. We're internationalists. We believe that it's the coming together of workers of different countries that can solve the problems. Having said that, you see, what I find often is the way they try to portray communists and left-wing people is they hate the country they live in. They hate their own country.
If you hate Britain so much, then why didn't you just go to Cuba
somewhere else,
or go to Vietnam?
But that's not true, you see. We don't hate the country we live in. Actually, we love the countries that we live in.
Yeah.
It's precisely because we love the country that we want everybody in this country to have a good job, to have good wages. We want everybody in this country to be able to have a good education for their kids. We want everybody to have a good healthcare system available for them rather than having to pay for it. Because the way we're going, in this so-called national unity, some people are going to be able to afford the private healthcare they want to force us to pay for, and the poorer layers are not. Where's the national unity where a section of the population literally is looking at the possibility of dying early because they can't afford the healthcare that they want to force on us in the future? So that's not the national. That's not what we love. What we love is the country we live in should be a country where everybody can live a reasonable life. But that means logically that loving your own country means also loving the countries of other people too.
Right.
Because it's only collaborating together with people in other countries that we can actually achieve the kind of life we would like to have. Now, people can be proud of their cultural heritage. You know, there's nothing wrong in being proud of Shakespeare or Dante or whatever culture you adhere to. That's a different question. You can be proud of that. You can be proud of your language. You can be proud of the food, depending on.
Yeah, but maybe in the UK there's a slightly tougher
Depending
sell.
on the country you live in.
A slightly tougher sell in the UK.
That is a separate. The point is this: the nationalism which says that what comes first is the unity of the poor with the rich of each country is a nationalism we reject.
Yes.
Now, there's also different types of nationalisms. There's the nationalism which emerged at, let's say, the peak of the British Empire,
Yeah.
which treated the peoples that they were colonizing as inferior, almost animal-like people.
Often worse than animals.
Well, slavery itself, the way they justified slavery,
Yeah.
for example, and the slave trade.
Yeah, slave masters
Was
treated
to-
their dogs better than they treated human beings.
Well, the way to do it was to actually create the idea that black people are inferior, or not even human, fully human. That makes it easier to treat them like animals. That was the worst nationalism that we've seen, in the sense of the idea of a supreme or superior people. That's one kind of nationalism, the extreme form which we would reject. There's another, however, which is the nationalism of the oppressed peoples. And there are sometimes, you see the nationalism of let's say the nationalism of an African people or an Asian people.
Or the Palestinians, perhaps.
The Palestinians is another
You've
example.
been on telly a couple of times in the past few weeks where you specifically made the point that we as communists support the aspiration of the Palestinian people to a homeland.
That's right.
To a nation.
Every people has the right to a homeland. Now, the nationalism of oppressed peoples, for instance, the nationalism of the peoples who rose up against the British Empire, the nationalism of the Indians as they rose up against the British, is a different kind of nationalism to the nationalism which was of the British who were oppressing them. It had a revolutionary kernel to it, it had a revolutionary content to it, because it was the aspirations of a whole people to remove the oppressor.
Yeah, it was a strike against colonialism and imperialism by necessity.
That's right. That's why there's not one form of nationalism.
Sure.
It's also true that once these nations have achieved nationhood, India removed the colonial yoke, then the same nationalism which earlier on would have been the nationalism of an oppressed people can transform itself into the nationalism of a Modi.
Well, take, for example, the question of the struggle for Irish liberation. James Connolly famously says, while
right.
at one stage armed and organised alongside with bourgeois Republican nationalists, he said to the working class elements, basically, if we succeed, keep hold of your guns and watch out for these guys, watch out for these bourgeois nationalists, because they're going to be our enemies.
That's right. If you think about it, today in India, the nationalism of a Modi has within it the oppression of the Muslims of India. Why? Because they need to divide and rule. to distract attention from the problems of Indian capitalism, the Hindu majority is pushed against the Muslim minority. So where's the nationalism here?
Yes.
Are the Muslims of India not also Indian citizens? And this happens in many countries. You have these minorities. Where's the nationalism?
Yes.
If nationalism is everybody in that country who's a citizen should come together, how do you explain this phenomenon?
Yeah, well, Lenin once said, I think that you alluded to it earlier, that nationalism can be the shell within which is contained a revolutionary kernel, but he also said that it could be a shell which contains a reactionary kernel.
Of course.
And Lenin was always very clear, even in contexts where the communists unequivocally supported the struggle of an oppressed people. In the case of Poland comes to mind, for example, he nevertheless insisted on the independence of the working class elements. He said that you must not blend your banners with the bourgeois nationalists, because when it comes down to it, they're not our allies.
No. Well, we've seen it many times where a nation aspiring to nationhood finally achieves it, and then within its borders you have oppression of other peoples. You look across many countries, you'll see it. Minorities, sometimes significant minorities, that are oppressed within that nation, which earlier was in a fight against the imperialist dominators. So nationalism changes over time, but if you want to give the final short answer is, we're internationalists, and we believe that workers of each country can defend their interests far better in a common struggle with the workers of other countries, and not in a common front with their own oppressors.
All right, last one. What would communism look like? We don't know. End the episode. That's it.
Yes. Well, would the capitalists or the bourgeois that fought under Cromwell to change society in Britain have really been able to answer the question, what would advanced capitalism look like?
Well, they didn't even know they were going to kill King Charles to begin with.
They wouldn't have known. But what we can say is it's also not true to say that, we don't know anything. We do know. First of all, it would be a nationalized planned economy. The means of production, the big means of production, would be publicly owned. They would not function on the basis of profit for a private individual, but would be used for the benefit of humanity as a whole. Just to go back to the question of water. If water were publicly owned, the money that we've thrown away over the years to the private investors would have been used to improve the techniques, to massively increase the capacity to recycle water, to cleanse water, and not to throw waste into rivers. But that doesn't apply. People sometimes say, water's okay. The railways, the same thing. We would have created a much better railway network had it been public, even under capitalism, by the way. But under a communist society, publicly owned transport would actually mean, for example, providing transport, good quality transport, to such a level that we could massively reduce the amount of vehicles on the roads, which are contributing enormously to pollution and to the health of people who have to breathe the air that these fumes pollute. So it would be publicly owned, it would be planned, but who would be running these companies? Again, it would not be capitalists, because there would be no private ownership of the means of production, but it wouldn't be unelected, untouchable bureaucrats either. It would have to be officials who are elected to the position. Now people say, you can't have meetings every day. Of course not. You can't have an assembly every day on how to run a factory. But you can have regular assemblies over a period. You can have different opinions expressed on how that company should be run. And according to a well-informed workforce, you would be able to proceed to elections of officials whose job would be to run that particular unit of production. elected to a position like that, the workers would elect those you would think would be the most experienced, the most skilled, the most educated in that field. But they would be required not to earn the wages of privilege, but to earn the wages of the people who have elected them. And you'd have election of delegates to higher bodies. You'd have the right of recall. Today they say we have a democracy. What we have today is every 5 years or so, one group of politicians promises you they will do this, this, and this in order to win the elections. They get elected, and then the remaining period of the 5 years is spent discussing why they're not carrying out what they promised, why they're doing this instead of that. We see it today with Starmer. But people have realized that what they voted for is not what they're getting. Where's the mechanism to say, just a minute, stop this. You've been there 6 months, we can see where you're going, we want to remove you. We want the right to elect people who are definitely going to carry out what they promise. There is no such mechanism under capitalism. Under communism, you would have such a mechanism. It would be the guy that we've elected is not doing what they're supposed to be doing. We're going to call an assembly to change that elected official, a delegate, etc. And it would work all the way through the system. The means of production that way, the priority would be what is good for the whole of society, not what is good for an individual or a small group of owners. And in such a society, the immense wealth which today is privately appropriated and held by a small minority, these individuals who, they go up in a spacecraft to feel the effect of weightlessness for a few seconds, and it costs them billions to achieve.
I prefer the ones that go down to the ocean floor in badly made submarines, personally.
Yeah, yes. But when I see that, I think, my God, they have billions to make toys for themselves, basically, where there's people who are going hungry. That's an example of how that wealth, if it was collectively controlled, would be used to solve the real problems of society. Income, they say, communists want everybody to be poor, equally poor. No, I think communists want everybody to be equally well off. I'm not fighting to make everybody equal to the poorest person on the planet. I'm fighting so that everybody has a decent house, everybody has a decent school in their neighborhood for their kids, has enough teachers in that school to provide their kids with a good education. Everybody has a clinic or a hospital they can go to in a moment of need. Everybody can go and visit the doctor, not have to call, hoping that you'll get a call back, and sometimes never get one, but actually have a doctor that's available. That can only be achieved by using the collectively produced wealth of millions in a rational, planned way to provide those services under the control of the working class. And if we have an institution which says everybody that's elected can be recalled by the body that elected them at any time if they're not carrying out the program they were elected on, and two, anybody that's elected must live on the wages of the people that have elected them. Because think about it, if being elected to Parliament means, like Starmer, you receive £100,000 in donations of clothing, I often wonder, how many clothes do you have to wear? Or Marcos, the wife of Marcos, do you remember the dictator?
Yeah.
3,000 pairs of shoes. I was trying to work out
So that's 2 feet.
How long it would take to wear all those shoes, That shows you the absurdity of this system. But if the political system is structured in a way like the one we have, that to be elected to a position automatically puts you on the road of privilege. First of all, you start getting an MP's wages, which is a lot higher than a worker's wage. But on top of that, you get all the other perks. You get all the connections. How many politicians do you see retire from politics and that you find them on the board of directors of this company, of that company, or they go and do conferences, then they pay them £200,000 for an hour
The revolving
of talking. They are they're opening the door to enormous wealth and privilege. Inevitably, a political system that's based on that is going to have corrupt politicians. If we establish the rule, you live on the wage of the workers that elected you, and they are going to scrutinize everything you do. Obviously, if somebody's elected and has to travel for work, will pay for the travel. Has to stay in a hotel, pay for the hotel. But the wages that he lives on, or she lives on, must correspond to the working people that they've elected by. Just to really, really simplify it, if an MP, when he's asked to vote a budget which includes massively increasing the cost of gas or electricity or fuel, lives on the wages of ordinary working people, maybe he'll think twice before doing something like that.
Yeah.
But when they live in privileged conditions, they act like privileged people and the class they represent. Communism would be the exact opposite of that. All officials will be elected, would be recallable, and would have to live on the wages of the people that elected them. In that sense, think about it. It would be in their interest then, if you want to improve your standard of living, you've got to improve it for all working people together, collectively. And then, you'll have all the services, the good housing, the hospitals, etc. Life would become reasonable and good for the mass of people. In the long run, once such a system gets off the ground and starts functioning, people would see the benefits of such a system. And they say, how could... Once it's established and people look back in history and say, there was a time when the wealth you produced was appropriated by a small minority that used it for their own benefit while people starved in some parts of the world. In other parts, there were wars over the resources and spheres of influence. This was what it was like in the past. And you say, do you want to go back to that? I think society would say no. Just as today, you ask any average person, do you want to go back to being a serf on the land under a feudal lord? Who would say yes to that?
Or even under capitalism at a certain stage, you could say, they used to send kids in London up chimneys with long brushes, and they'd clean out the chimneys of the rich, and they'd all come down with bent spines and broken bones, and they'd have emphysema, and they'd die in their early teens, and they'd suffer abuse and exploitation. That was a barbaric way to live. That was only Britain 100 years ago.
That's right.
150 years ago. That was still capitalism.
Yeah.
It was an earlier form of capitalism, but nevertheless it was capitalism.
But those conditions still exist in places
Of
like
course.
the Congo today.
That's the thing. That hasn't been overcome in many places around the world.
But can I just add, maybe this is one final thought on this.
Sure.
We can discuss a rough idea of what the future society would be, and a few basic ideas are there. The publicly owned, planned, democratically planned, and workers' control, workers' management, etc. And the future generations will decide in which direction they want to go. But our task today is actually establishing the early conditions for such a society to begin to develop. For that to happen, capitalism has to be removed. The means of production have to be collectively owned. The planned economy has to be put in place and has to start functioning. The future generations will then carry it forward to, I would imagine, undreamt of heights which are possible. But today, the task is actually not to daydream about what the future society will be, but actually to remove this rotten society and allow for the early foundations of a new society to be established.
And if we're going to do that, then we need an organisation that's capable of providing leadership when it comes to the revolutionary movements that will finally overthrow capitalism in one country after another and lay the basis for socialism, a just, decent form of society that can provide a mode of living worthy of humanity. And we're trying to build exactly that leadership here in the Revolutionary Communist International. As ever, check out our website, Marxist.com, and find out more about how you can get involved if you agree with anything that you've heard today. Fred, that was great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me again.
And thank you to Google for the very interesting questions. We'll see you all next week.
A specter is haunting Europe. The specter of communism.
Communism. stronger, more determined than ever.
Communist.
Communism. The communists. The communists. The communists.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
I'll guarantee that 10 minutes from now, a lot of you are going to have a new understanding of communism.
Is Donald Trump a fascist? Is he undermining democracy? What's going on in the world and where is it going? Those are questions that millions of people have been asking in the past months. And those are the questions that we will try to answer in this week's podcast. And with us, I have Alan Woods, a Marxist theoretician and author of a whole series of books. Amongst those are Bolshevism, The Road to Revolution, which is the history of the Russian Bolshevik Party, The History of Philosophy, a Marxist perspective, which is self-explanatory, and The Class Struggles in Rome. Now, Alan is here today to discuss his latest work, which is an article called The Meaning of Donald Trump, a Marxist Analysis. This article will be published tomorrow on our website, marxist.com, on the 21st of March. If you're watching this after the 21st of March, we will link in the description to this article. If you're watching on the 20th, then you will have to wait in anticipation. Welcome back to the show, Alan.
My pleasure.
Now, before we dive into this important work that you have prepared for our website, I think we need to comment on the latest events of the past week. There's been a lot happening. There's been a resumption of conflict in Gaza, with Israel bombing Gaza, killing hundreds of people. Unfortunately, we won't have time to really dive into this important question, so we'll deal with that properly next week. However, there's been another event which is, from a world political perspective, more consequential, which is the phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, which took place 2 days ago. And this was an important turning point in the Ukrainian conflict. What came out of this phone call was an agreement between America and Russia to begin a ceasefire, a limited ceasefire in Ukraine, covering energy facilities, attacks on energy facilities for 30 days, as well as a prisoner exchange of 125 prisoners, and the beginning of technical discussions for also the implementation of a ceasefire in the Black Sea, followed by further negotiations this Sunday in Saudi Arabia between America and Russia, with the aim of achieving a full settlement of this war and a peace, essentially, in Ukraine. Now, just to give a bit of background to our readers to this ceasefire agreement, this came after a French proposal of having a ceasefire of the air entirely in Ukraine, which meant that no aerial bombardments or sorties should take place in Ukraine. The Ukrainians, then, following negotiations with the Americans, came up with a unconditional full ceasefire. But Putin made it clear that he would not agree to that, because this would only be to the benefit of Ukraine, which is losing in the battlefield, losing men, losing arms, declining in morale, and without checks to ensure that Ukraine would not use this period to rearm and regroup and prepare for a new battle, which would extend the war. He said they couldn't agree to this, and therefore they've proposed this new deal, which, it seems to me, well, I think this to everyone, mainly benefits the Russians, because the Russians don't carry out regular, daily, let's say, massive attacks against Ukrainian energy facilities. What they do is, with an interval of around 1 to 1.5 months, they carry out massive attacks. And therefore, for them to stop now for a month wouldn't be that much of a change from their previous actions. Whereas they were, how do you say, the Ukrainians were attacking Russian energy facilities, which were a certain nuisance, let's put it like that, to Russia. So this is all in Russia's favor. And this is something that the bourgeois can see in the Financial Times. They interviewed a former director for Russia on the US National Security Council. This was during Trump's first term. And she says, she complained, Putin has not shifted from anything. The US is negotiating with itself all over the place. He wants to win the war. What do you think, Alan? Do you think he wants to win the war?
Who?
Putin.
Putin? Well, if he's in a war, obviously he's in to win, isn't he? He's certainly not in to lose. And he's not losing. The fact of the matter is, and I think that any half-intelligent person must now realize this, Russia is not just winning the war, Russia has won the war. This war, from the standpoint of the Ukrainians, is lost. That's the starting point. You see, we talk about negotiations, yes, but what drives negotiations in a situation like this is first and foremost events on the battlefield. You know, wars are fought and won not around the negotiating table, but on the battlefield. Now, if you just look at the events of the last few days, actually, the last week, it's been quite a dramatic turn in events. For example, this adventure of Zelensky, it was a very foolish adventure, of sending troops into Russian territory, into the Kursk region, which was trumpeted. By the way, it's quite amusing if you read the press coverage, the Western coverage at the time. Yes. I advised our audience to do this. Actually, just read what they said. Oh, they were cock-a-hoop. They were really enthusiastic. This was a great thing, the greatest thing since sliced bread. This was a stroke of genius on Zelensky's part. Look, yes. They've invaded Russia. They've taken the Russians by surprise, which I questioned at the time. I still question it, by the way, whether they were in reality taken by surprise. Yes. But in any case, oh yes, it was going to shock Putin. It was going to cause a reaction against the war, and so on and so forth. Well, not so. There were some people, some intelligent people, that hadn't lost their heads entirely, that pointed out at the time this was a big mistake. Worse than a mistake, it's a catastrophe. Yeah. And it's ended in a catastrophe. What you now see in Kursk is actually, and by the way, there's been a deafening silence about this in the Western media now. They were so cocky about it when it began. Now they're silent about what's actually happening in the Kursk, which is actually, I'll spell it out. Read my lips. This, what you see in Kursk at the present time, is the biggest catastrophe, military catastrophe, in the entire history of the last, 3 years of war in the Ukraine. And the actual, the loss of life, for a start, on the Ukrainian side, is absolutely appalling. The Ukrainians have been driven out. Now, of course, they probably turn on, as they said at the time of the last offensive. It's a funny thing, you know. The Ukrainian offensive was lost. Well, let me put it in plain English. In a war, battles are not won. People are defeated. They don't like to say this. The Ukrainians have been repeatedly defeated by the Russians. They don't like to use that expression, but it's a fact. And this has been a catastrophic and humiliating defeat, costing, I don't know how many lives. No, they lie. No, but look, both sides don't tell the truth about the casualties. There's no means of knowing how many lives are lost. But certainly, the loss of life, and it's a decisive difference, you see. I mean, Russia, after all, is a big country with a big population. They can afford to take a certain amount of casualties. Ukraine cannot. And the present loss of life in the Ukraine means these losses cannot be replaced. Yes. And that puts the Ukrainian army ultimately in an impossible position. Now, this is decisive. Absolutely decisive. And it will have a big effect on the war in general. Which, the fact that the war is now lost, I think that's understood now by most intelligent people. It's denied, of course, in Europe, but there we are. The Europeans are running around now like chickens with their heads chopped off. The leaders I'm talking about, the politicians, the Macrons and the Starmers and other idiots, which I've never seen such a bunch of incompetent rulers in the Western world. The entire course of my life, and that's quite a long life at the present time. But in any case, they understand nothing, and they're in a state of denial. Yes. But certainly the Americans have understood. Or at least let's put it this way: the Trump administration has understood this. Yeah. Donald J. Trump understood. You can say what you like about Trump, and many things are said about him. But one thing is, he's not stupid. No, yes. You can accuse him of many things. You can't accuse him of that. And he understands this quite well. Vance, his vice president, understands this perfectly well. They all understand that the Ukrainians have lost. When he turned to Zelensky in that infamous incident in the Oval Office and said, "Look, you haven't got any cards to play." That's absolutely good. Putin's got all the cards, and that's decisive. Yes. And I wonder that before we proceed any further in this, one thing strikes me, which many things are incredible to my way of thinking, but the most astonishing thing is this: one would have thought, would one not, after 3 years of terrible bloodshed and suffering, particularly of the Ukrainian people, the Russians also, but the Ukrainians in particular, are the main victims in this actually. It's one thing that continually appalls me in the attitude of people like Starmer and Macron and others, who pretend to be the friends of Ukraine. Oh yeah, they're friends of the Ukraine, they support the Ukraine. Really? Look, let me tell you something. I mean, with friends like these, the Ukrainian people don't need enemies. Yeah. These so-called friends are pushing the Ukrainians to continue a war which they must know cannot be won, and it only leads to further slaughter, further senseless slaughter, and further killing. Now, whatever you think about Donald Trump, he was elected in the States with a promise to end the war in the Ukraine. And I've no doubt whatsoever that he wants to end for certain reasons, different reasons. He wants to end this war. So he's talking to the Russians. What a terrible crime.
Yes, a lot of people
What a terrible crime. He's actually, by the way, Biden never talked to the Russians for the last 3 years. It must be unprecedented in the history of world diplomacy that for a period of 3 years, between the two major superpowers and the two major nuclear powers, moreover, there's been absolutely no communication whatever. This is dangerous. Yeah. Some people talk, oh no, you could have a third world war. Donald Trump is coming, it means a third world war. No such thing. On the contrary, if there was ever a danger of a third world war, and by the way, it did come, I think we came perilously close to it, in the latter stages of the Biden regime, because there was no communication between the two major nuclear powers, none whatever. That's dangerous in and of itself. That was never the case, by the way, even in the worst period of the Cold War, where there were very tense and very bitter relations, hostility between the Americans and the Russians. There was never a period where there was not some kind of negotiations or contacts taking place at some level. Yeah. Now there's none. Even the embassies were closed. Astonishing. Now Donald Trump says that from any point of view, it's at least rational. The man wants to talk to Putin, talk to the Russians at least, re-establish some kind of normal diplomatic relationship and talk about it and negotiate. Oh, no. This is portrayed as a betrayal by people, idiots, imbeciles, like Starmer. I'm ashamed to say that he's our British Prime Minister. Don't know for how long. Not long, I hope. And Macron, that French idiot, that French crowing cockerel in Paris, portray this. And of course, the Ukrainians, this is a betrayal. Why, I ask myself, Is it wrong? Is it a betrayal for Americans and Russians to talk together and try to find some kind of a way out of this mess? And by the way, it's perfectly clear, and that's the real meaning of these phone conversations, especially the last one which you mentioned. There are only two nations which can stop this war, and it's not Paris, and it's not London, and it's certainly not Kiev, where they're determined to continue the war, by the way, although it's disastrous for the Ukrainian people above all. The only two nations which are capable of halting this bloodshed is precisely Russia and the United States. And therefore, from that point of view, the negotiations obviously are necessary and dare I say, productive.
Yes, I mean, just following on from what you just said, it's interesting because we've been told that this is a unilateral, unprovoked war by Russia against Ukraine. And you might wonder, if it was so, how can it be that peace negotiations are taking place between the United States and Russia? how can
Well,
that would imply that that's not quite the case.
Well, it isn't the case, as a matter of fact. And I mean, look, in any war, they say that the first casualty of war is the truth. And that's true of any war. And in any war, you get a colossal barrage of propaganda, the fog of propaganda, fog of all kinds of lies and distortion. You expect that. But I've never seen in my life such an appalling level of misinformation, of lies, constant stream of lies. By the way, they're trapped now. It's quite amusing if you've got a sense of humor. You watch these programs on television now. What's the news? See how they report all these developments. These guys are told so many lies for the last 3 years. They're finding it difficult now to retreat and to tell the truth.
Themselves up.
Now they're in trouble.
Yeah.
How do you explain for 3 years we were told that the Ukrainians were advancing, the Ukrainians were defeating the Russians.
Russia was running out of missiles.
The Russians. I remember distinctly about 2 years ago, at the time of the Battle of Bakhmut, it was, that the Russians were said they'd run out of so many things. They were now fighting with shovels. Well, all I can say is they must have some very effective shovels.
In fact, they do have some very effective shovels.
Yeah, they do. So that's another matter. It's a fact that they do use sharp shovels as weapons of hand-to-hand fighting. But that's a separate question. The Russians are not running sort of ammunition or bayonets or
to the contrary,
or shovels if it comes to that.
In fact, we were told that Russia is running out of missiles, and
Yes.
Russia is running out of tanks, and Russia is running out of everything.
Yes.
However, as you pointed out in the beginning of the war, I remember you wrote an article in April 2002, and you wrote, Russia has the bigger population and bigger industrial base, and therefore that is bound to be the decisive question in the longer term. And that is in fact what happened. That Russia, while Russia could keep mobilizing, the Ukrainians are running out of men.
Yes.
While Russia mobilized the whole of the economy, and the military industry, which is primarily state-owned, the West actually fell behind. So not only did the Russians not run out of missiles, but Western missiles are now running low on stocks, whereas Russia could outproduce them in tanks, in artillery, in missiles, in planes, drones.
Yes, it's an
all
actual
these things.
fact. All the Western countries, starting with the United States, by the way, now find that their arsenals are seriously depleted in every respect, in terms of ammunition, tanks, missiles, you name it. Because they've shipped them all to the Ukraine. The British Army is in a lamentable state. How the hell Starmer can have the brazen cheek to say, oh, we can send whatever it is, 30,000 troops to fight in the Ukraine? They cannot. That's a straight lie. I think some British officers have been quite annoyed about this, but army officers, even papers like the Daily Telegraph,
Yes.
which is bitterly hostile to Russia and in favour of the Ukraine, has stated, Starmer, you're prepared to send British troops to the Ukraine, you're not prepared to give them the proper arms and equipment, so you're putting them in harm's way. That's the truth. The British Army's in a lamentable state. That's perfectly correct. Why? Because they've shipped all their weapons and stuff to the Ukraine for the last 3 years. Same goes for all these countries. They're all in the same. The Russians, on the other hand, are not short of anything because they're. By the way, one lie which they constantly repeat. Oh yes, Russia's a war economy. Russia's not a war economy at all. They've got a perfectly normal economy, perfectly normal industries. All of them are producing commodities the same as any other time. The Russian economy, even the World Bank admits this, the IMF admits this, was, I think they expanded last year by almost 5%, which is colossal compared to the miserable figures in Britain is 0% and so on and so forth. Well, yeah, they're producing all kinds of things, and arms as well, on top of that.
Yes.
That's because they got a far more efficient industry than, industry in Britain has been destroyed by Thatcher and other Tory governments years ago. But in any case, they are short of weapons, that's perfectly true. The Russians are not, that's nonsense. And therefore the Russians are in, the idea that Russia's about to run out of, that's the other argument. Oh no, if only we could hang on for a little bit, a few months, Russia's going to run out of this and run out of, Russia's not going to run out of anything anytime soon. They can continue for quite some time. Ukraine, of course, cannot. The Ukraine is entirely dependent, and has been dependent for some time, for its arms, weapons, and money entirely on the West, on America, on Europe, and so on.
Yes, the West provides the arms, the intelligence, even the coordination.
Yes.
Ukraine provides the men.
Yes.
There is unfortunately, there wasn't enough time to prepare for today, but there is a damning report by a Russian liberal, a pro-Ukrainian Russian, who went to Ukraine and traveled for 2 months in the fronts. And it is horrifying. The picture that he paints, we want to come do that in a proper way, but do it justice next week, hopefully. But what he explains is a situation where there's a terror, a fear of death, fear of, everyone knows that you go to the army, it's a one-way ticket to death. There's hatred against the ruling class and the regime, which is basically just throwing the generation after generation into a meat grinder. The most feared word in the Ukraine now is not Russia, which was the case in the beginning of the war, but is the TCC, which is the mobilization forces, the people who go around the cities, literally catch young men and bust them off. And therefore the second most popular word in Ukraine today is bussification, which is what they call this thing. They talk about it as a slave market, where brigades come up and look at all of these poor young men sitting there in the waiting rooms, just directly snatched off the streets, and pick out the ones that look the strongest to go to the better brigades. The other ones are thrown in as cannon fodder. And yes, it is a Western proxy war fought with the blood of the Ukrainian nation.
Well, it's not even that. It's actually. You see, to go back to your original statement, which we didn't deal with, this war was deliberately provoked. Let's be clear about it. Not by the Russians, not by Putin. That's not true. It was deliberately provoked by the Americans, and by Biden in particular, and by NATO. The expansion of NATO, by the way, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the West promised time after time, they pledged themselves publicly, it's on the public record, it's not a secret, that the NATO would not advance one step beyond Germany. What's happened since then? They've steadily advanced. Poland, the Balkan states, the Baltic states, and so on and so forth, right up Romania, right up to the border of the Soviet Union. And they were warned about this from the Russians repeatedly. And the Russians also warned them, look, so far and no further, and the Ukraine, under no circumstances will Ukraine be allowed to join NATO. Because that's too much to put NATO bases, and by the way, potentially with nuclear weapons, right next door to Russia in Ukraine. That was too much. They were warned. But they persisted in this. And that's precisely what led, and other factors as well. Then you had, of course, the Maidan coup d'etat, which was a movement entirely sponsored by the West, by the Americans in particular, which overthrew the existing government and installed a pro-American, pro-Western government, which immediately proceeded to resort to the most scandalous, oppressive measures against the Russian-speaking people in the Ukraine, which, by the way, account for a very large minority. 25%, maybe as much as a third, are Russian speakers. Had their rights taken away and were subject to the most brutal oppression, and which forced them to a position where they had to defend themselves. And that led to a chain of events which inevitably culminated eventually in the Russian intervention and the present war. So that was brought about deliberately by the West. And what was the intention? The intention was to use the Ukraine, cynically to use the Ukrainian people, in order to weaken, to create a war with Russia, in which Russia would be defeated and weakened. That was the whole purpose of it. By the way, they were so enthusiastic, the Western leaders, most of them were quite exuberant about all this. They were quite cocky about it. They were sure that with the NATO's weapons and money and arms and all the rest of it, that they would soon defeat the Russians, and they would reduce the Russians to a subjugated nation. Some of them even spoke about the breakup of Russia into separate units and so on. In other words, to reduce Russia to a colony. That was the serious intention, and these people, sanctions also as well.
Joe Biden talked about regime change.
Of course. The whole purpose of it was to bring down Putin, create regime change in Moscow, which would bring about a pro-Western government and the subjugation of Russia to the West. Simple as that. Yeah, but it didn't turn out like that. All these clever plans have just blown up in their faces because Russia was not defeated. They were not defeated by sanctions. And by the way, the sanctions were absolutely incredible, which were inflicted on the Russians to destroy the Russian economy or weaken it. Instead of that, the Russian economy has survived and has actually thrived on the basis of creating their own industries and investing the money which previously was invested in the West is now being invested in Russia, creating an enormous boom in production. Now, all of this, of course, means that the whole plan, the so-called Project Ukraine, has ended in tears, ended in utter shipwreck. And now, of course, they're scrambling to try to find a way out of this mess. But, of course, the mess gets bigger every day. And every day that they prolong this war, of course, the result will be worse. Worse for the Ukraine, worse for Europe, worse for the entire world, except for Russia, of course, which will gain.
Now, you mentioned before that the Biden administration had cut all communications, almost all communications with the Russians. And instead, what we see in the readout from the phone call between Trump and Putin a few days ago, in the American readout, it says, the two leaders agreed that a future with an improved bilateral relationship between the United States and Russia has huge upside. This includes enormous economic deals and geopolitical stability when peace has been achieved. Now, this is a significant change from a point of view, from the situation where the United States and Russia have no communications and sanctions. There's a sanction regime on Russia. To this, and what do you think this reflects in terms of world relations?
Well, potentially it reflects a very great deal. I mean, to begin with, you see, from the standpoint of Donald Trump, from the standpoint of American interests, this administration and the USA itself is interested, should be interested, in arriving at least at a reasonable relationship with the Russians. How far this will go, I don't know. I think you might be a little bit previous in your predictions. Admittedly, they're talking about the re-establishment of commercial relations, possibly the withdrawal of sanctions, and so on. If that were to be the case, by the way, it would benefit the world economy, it would benefit America. The renewal of trade in Russian oil and gas alone would mean a lowering of energy prices, which, as you know, is one of the main causes of inflation in the West at the present time. That's true. Whether or not that's going to happen, that's unclear to me. It's unclear to me how far these negotiations are going to go, because for a start, the Europeans are opposed to these negotiations. They're trying to sabotage them.
Yes.
That's the meaning of Starmer's policy and Macron's policy, which is quite insane, as a matter of fact. But they will not prevent a Russian victory, but they will prolong this war as much as possible. Why? For a very simple reason. They want to ensure that America maintains the security arrangement which it's had with Europe since the end of the Second World War. That's to say that the Americans act as a kind of shield, a nuclear shield, against possible war with Russia, of course, evidently, in the first instance. Now, this is now in doubt. I've no doubt whatever that Trump would like to change this. He'd like to get out of Europe. Europe no longer occupies the same important place as it once did in American strategic interests. That's perfectly true. Now, the only thing is that it may be logical, but at the same time, there are many forces which militate against that. For a start, the Ukrainians will do their best. Zelensky is doing his best to sabotage the negotiations, and continue the war. In this madness, it is madness because it will mean ultimately the destruction of the Ukraine. He's being supported by the Europeans, by Starmer and Macron in particular, who are pushing the Ukraine. Let's call a spade a shovel. They're pushing for their own cynical reasons. They're pushing the Ukrainians into the abyss.
Yeah.
They're pushing it in a direction which, if it continues like this, it will potentially lead to the complete and utter destruction of the Ukraine as a nation. If they were able to reach some kind of a deal with the Russians now, at least something could be salvaged. Although the Ukraine would lose part of its territory, there's no two ways about that, because they've lost the war. In a war, as you know, I mean, it's a fact, it's maybe a regrettable fact, but it's a fact nonetheless. In a war, it's the victors which impose their terms, and the defeated party must accept whatever terms they offer. Simple as that. But if they don't reach a deal, and they don't reach some kind of an agreement, then all that will happen is the war will continue. The Ukrainians will suffer dreadful losses, horrific losses, and ultimately it will lead to the destruction of the Ukraine as a country altogether, which is not a good result from anybody's point of view.
No. You talk about Europe. The Europeans, as you say, are terrified of what's happening here. They would lose the American support, and they would lose their standing in world politics. They would be reduced to third-rate, fourth-rate powers, depending on their sides. And therefore, we see this drive towards militarism, rearmament. The German Parliament, very undemocratically, has voted through the lifting of the debt ceiling, allowing for a 400 billion euro investment in infrastructure and an unlimited investment, but which is probably going to be around 500 billion euros in defense spending. The EU has come out with a plan to create an 800 billion euro defense fund, although we're not going to go into that, but that's probably going to fall apart. But country after country is now calling for a raising of the defense spending to at least 3% of GDP. NATO has been out, Mark Rutte has been out saying you need to raise it to at least 3, maybe even 5%. And you have, as you said, our Starmer here in Britain, launching the Coalition of the Willing, which incidentally is the name of the coalition that went into Iraq.
It's a very unfortunate name.
This didn't end well. And he had this Zoom meeting, which no one knows who actually participated, a series of like-minded countries. And they're now talking about an operational phase of sending troops to Ukraine. Of course, they want the Americans to guarantee their security. In essence, they want the Americans to do it for them. But all of this is a part of this militarization. And one thing is whether they will succeed in this or not. But the other question is the economic impact that this is going to have. Already, in Britain, the Labour Party has announced £5 billion worth of cuts, another approximately the same amount to be announced in the next period. These 5 billion are primarily aimed at disabled people and benefit receivers, people on universal credit. And there's going to be a blanket cuts of up to 7% in all of the different departments. This barely covers the debt servicing costs, which are increasing massively. The interest rates are going up. Last December, Britain paid almost £9 billion in debt servicing alone. And in the middle of all of this, they want to raise their defense spending. Now, just to give an example, this last year, defense spending in Britain was 58.8 billion. They want to raise this to 2.5%. It was around 2.3%. They want to raise it to 2.5%. That would mean another 5 billion, a bit more than 5 billion pounds spent. That's just 1.5%. They want to raise it a further 5% to 3% of GDP by 2030. So we are talking tens of billions of pounds extra spent every year on military, while the economy is in recession and declining, while the debt servicing costs are rising, and they are attacking benefits, disabled people, working people, ordinary people, welfare in general. That's a nightmare. That's a recipe for crisis. What's your take on this issue?
Well, you know, I'm very fond of Peter Sellers. He was a very good, funny actor when he was alive. And one of his early films is called The Mouse That Roared. Have you seen that film?
No.
I recommend it. It's The Mouse That Roared. Yeah. I think you find it quite amusing. And this situation reminds me of that. The European. Europe is the mouse that roars. A mouse that tries to roar. And there's nothing more ridiculous than that. No spectacle more ridiculous. There's nothing more ridiculous than this scramble of the Europeans, the bragging and the boasting and talking about arms and interventions and sending peacekeepers to the Ukraine. Peacekeepers to the Ukraine? What are you talking about? Look, for a start, the Russians have said, Putin has said, he said it repeatedly, we will not accept any NATO troops or any foreign troops from NATO, from Europe, in the Ukraine. And if they're sent, we will treat them as combatants and we will liquidate them, which they will. So that's the first point. Secondly, of course, Starmer and Macron know this. That's why they've raised it. They want to get the Americans, that's the whole purpose of it, to get the Americans involved in the war again. Something which Donald Trump is vigorously resisting and he will not accept. The whole basis of his policy to get out of the Ukraine, which is a sensible thing to do. And if the Europeans had any sense, they'd follow his lead. But there we are. They haven't got sense. Far from doing that, they want to pull the Americans in. And the idea is send this force. How many? 20,000? 30,000?
30,000.
30,000. Well, even if they don't even have 30,000. That's bullshit. But in any case, even if they had 30,000 troops, the Russians have got an army, of approaching 1 million now. What difference would that make? 30,000 is nothing. And they would instantly be liquidated, but they'd come back in body bags, as simple as that. Just imagine the effect that would have. Therefore, they would send these troops in, the troops would get shot to bits, surrounded, in difficulties. Then they'd immediately phone the Americans and demand that the Americans should save them. That's the whole purpose of it.
Yes.
Which would mean, by the way, what? An open military clash between the United States and Russia, which, by the way, as Biden himself pointed out, would mean World War III. Now, just imagine the lunacy of this policy. Absolute lunacy. Because the Americans are wise to it, they're not stupid. And they say, no. There ain't going to be no guarantee from us. You go into the Ukraine, that's your business, you're on your own.
Yeah.
Which they won't go in, by the way. Simple as that's just bluff. It's just stupid bluff on their part. But they turn on in order to impress the Americans, because Trump has said it makes sense. He said, in effect, look, we have supported you people long enough. It's cost us a lot of money, which it has. It is costing us a lot of money, which it is. They got huge debts, by the way, in the States. Also, it's not easy for them also. And we've had enough. Therefore, we're going to pull out eventually. You better start raising the money to pay for your own defense. That's at the bottom. So now they're scurrying around now, And what do they propose? Well, it's not a new policy. It was invented a long time ago by a man called Hermann Goering. You've heard of Hermann Goering? You know, Hitler's Minister for War, Minister of Defense, whatever he was. And he said the following. Defending rearmament of Germany, he said, the guns will make us great. Butter will only make us fat. Guns before butter.
That's what these guys are
Well,
saying.
he would know about being fat because he was rather fat himself, actually. And he never went short of butter in his life or anything else if it came to that. Guns before butter. That's the same old policy that they're plugging now. The problem, and the question is, where is this money going to come from? You might suggest taxing the rich. Oh, no question of that. This is a Labour government. Don't tax the rich. Good heavens above. No. No, tax the most, hit the most vulnerable. Cut the money for the most vulnerable, the sick, the disabled, and so on and so forth. They want to raise $5 billion. Do you know how much money Britain has sent to the Ukraine in the last 3 years? Or 2 years, I think it is. Isn't it 12 million, I think?
12 million, yeah.
12 billion. 12 billion pounds have been gone. So let's get this straight. Now get your head around this. There's no money for the poor. There's no money for hospitals. There's no money for schools. But there's plenty of money to send to the Ukraine.
In fact, Keir Starmer said we're going to send 3 billion
Yeah.
for as long as it takes.
There we are. For as long as that's nice.
Per
isn't it?
year.
That's nice. And therefore, it's the poor people in Britain, and the sick and the disabled and the old age pensioners, and the hospitals and the doctors and so on, that's going to pay for sending this money. By the way, this money that's sent to the Ukraine, how much money has been sent already? The Americans have sent a vast, billions and billions and billions have been sent. What's happened to this money? Trump is now asking, what have you done with this money? Good question. Nobody ever asked that question before. Why not, I wonder? Nobody's ever asked. You know, Zelensky actually had the bad cheek to actually admit, he was stupid enough to admit, he said, well, actually, he said, there's 100 billion that I can't account for. Now, just get your head around 100 billion. You'd think he's talking about 100 pence.
Yeah.
No, there's $100 billion, which you've sent us very kindly for the war, which I do not watch. I can't account for it.
Yeah.
Well, I can account for it. I'll tell you now where it is. You'll find it tucked away nicely in all kinds of Caribbean, shady Caribbean bank accounts. It's gone into the pockets of the corrupt Ukrainian ruling clique, the oligarchs, and Zelensky himself and his clique. You can be sure of it. You can be sure of it.
Yeah.
And yet, he's got the brazen cheek. Oh, no, we want more, even more. We want even more billions from you. And Starmer and Macron are sufficiently stupid or arrogant or whatever, or insane, to accept this. They want to saddle the British people, the French people, the European people with colossal debts incurred in order to provide new toys for the generals to play with. And also, of course, to the Ukrainian oligarchs to build nice mansions by the seaside in the Caribbean. Now, that's the fact. But who's saying this? Now, that's the thing that gets me. Who's saying this? Nobody's telling the British people the truth. Nobody's mentioning these facts. And yet they are facts. They cannot be denied. No. Zelensky's good. Zelensky's a hero. Zelensky's this. Zelensky is both a clown and a monster at the same time. And by the way, his policy, deliberate policy, is to engineer a direct clash military between America and Russia, which means the Third World War. For goodness sake, wake up, British people, wake up and understand what's happening. French people, wake up. European people, German people, wake up and understand what's happening. But no, there's a conspiracy on the part of the political establishment, including the so-called left. Good heavens, look, the German Greens. This horrible woman, Baerbock, whatever her name is. The Green Minister. One of the worst warmongers. The Greens in Germany used to organize demonstrations against armaments and wars. Not anymore. They're banging the drum now all the time in favor of war. War with Russia, if you please. Now, come on. Somebody is going to tell the truth. If nobody else will tell the truth, we will tell the truth to the British people and the American people and the German people. Now, in fairness to Trump, is no hero, but look at his monstrous conduct in relation to Gaza. I don't wish to defend Donald Trump, who is a reactionary bourgeois politician. But nevertheless, in what he says about Ukraine is correct. The reason he's saying it is that he's quite right. This war is not my war. It's not America's war. It's Biden's war. They deliberately engineered this war, and it's nothing to do with us, and it's not in our interest. That's a fact. And the sooner it's ended in disaster, it would inevitably have ended in disaster. I said it would end in disaster. Trump said, if I'd have been in charge, the war wouldn't have taken place. Well, I don't know whether that's true or false. It may well be true, by the way. Because he doesn't have quite the same ideas about foreign wars that Biden has. But in any case, he wants out. He wants out. His one mistake, I think, is that his one mistake, he should have said it straightforwardly to Zelensky right at the beginning. Look, we've had it with you. We spent enough money, wasted enough money on this war. We're out. Do what you like. That would have solved a lot of problems. Unfortunately, he allowed himself to be maneuvered into this business of negotiations and so on, which has complicated things somewhat. I don't think they'll lead anywhere, by the way, the negotiations. I'm sure they will not, because Zelensky is determined to sabotage them, like this so-called ceasefire, which the Ukrainians are already sabotaging. Of course, they have no interest. Zelensky's not interested in the ceasefire of any sort. He wants to continue the war. Why? Because his political survival depends upon it. Like he's got that in common with Netanyahu, as a matter of fact. They were similar characters, pursuing a similar catastrophic policy. But there we are. We leave that to one side.
Yes, there's a lot more to dive into, and we need to get you back to deepen these analyses. But I think we should move on to the more broader questions, because we have the entrance of Donald Trump on the scene has completely changed the world situation. It's had a direct impact in every country in the world. And in fact, we see a series of major crises erupting, all of which have been affected by his presidency. And at the same time, there is a lot of discussion out there. There's a lot of dust being thrown in people's eyes. There's a lot of confusion, and there's a lot of people who genuinely want to understand what's happening. What does all of this actually mean? Because if we look at the previous period, the previous epoch of world history with the post-war period, you see nothing like this phenomenon. Nothing that resembles what we stand in front of today. And I think this is the important thing to grapple with, and this is what your article is about that we will publish tomorrow. Now, the first question I think we should answer. There is a persistent claim that Donald Trump, we see him issuing presidential decrees. We see him bending or even ignoring the law in certain areas. And there is this idea that the rise of Donald Trump is a step back for democracy. Donald Trump is undermining democracy. We had democratic rights before that we don't have anymore. What do you think of these claims?
What do I think? Well, I think that there's a lot of hysteria being generated since the election of Trump, even before. All kinds of dire black warnings about the threat to democracy, fascism, I don't know what. Now, and even many people on the left have been affected by this, actually. And I don't know, Trump is presented as a source of all our evils, and like some kind of devil that's suddenly appeared by black magic or something like that. And by black magic, he seems to have got control of the United States of America. But you see, this doesn't answer. These are so-called explanations. explanations which explain nothing. It's just hot air, really. Now, the celebrated philosopher Spinoza, marvelous, profound philosopher, he once said that our task, the task of philosophy, is to neither weep nor to laugh, but to understand. Now let's set aside all the hysteria and all the noise and the din and the propaganda for a moment, and try to reflect, try to think with a cool head and answer the question, how does one explain, how can you explain the phenomenon of Donald Trump? Now, first of all, if he's responsible for all the evils which are being stated, they're all down to him. The wars, the crises, and the instability and so on. Now, that, really speaking, it's not possible for one person, one individual to do these things. No matter how clever he is, no matter how powerful he is and so on. No, it's just simply not possible. If it is true, and it is partly true, it is true what you say, that he certainly acted in a way which has led to these crises, but that can't be just because of him. It must be something that's inherent in the objective situation itself. And it is, in point of fact. Let me take one simple fact. You see, for a long period, at least since the fall of the Soviet Union, you had the phenomenon known as globalization, which was really an intensification of international trade, of the world division of labor, if you like. And that served a purpose because one of the contradictions which prevents the development of capitalism is the limitations of the national market. And therefore, by developing, Marx explains this in the third volume of Capital, you know, that one of the ways in which they get around, for example, the falling rate of profit, is to develop world trade. And this has been done in a colossal, unprecedented way for the last at least three or four decades. Yes, but this, of course, has now reached its limits. I won't go into the details. It's a separate discussion. It's reached its limits, and it's turning into its opposite. All the factors that made for the economic growth of the last period have now turned into their opposite. And instead of increasing world trade, you've got, instead of economic collaboration and the rest of it, you've got economic nationalism. Every bourgeois, every capitalist class is now defending its own interests against all others. And that's more true of the United States than anywhere else. And Donald Trump is like he's the kind of embodiment of this when he puts forward the idea, make America great again, you know. To make America great, the rest of the world, America first, he says. Well, if America's first, the rest of the world must be last, as they've just found out to their cost, with the introduction of tariffs and so on and so forth, which of course will just aggravate the crisis. There are no two ways about that. But there's that side to him, but there are other sides to Donald Trump. Now look, what is astonishing is this. I can't remember any election in which, and I'm going back to the first time he was elected, not before, it was 2016. 16, yeah. Such a colossal campaign against a particular individual to stop him from taking office. For example, he had no support whatsoever in the mass media, which is very powerful.
Yeah.
You know, the press, the TV, they were all against him in the most belligerent way, the most horrific way. And yet he won, despite that fact. And now you've got a repeat performance. I mean, the amount of not just hostile propaganda, but you get actual court cases, for example. I think there was over 100 court cases of his administration. And at least four of them were directed against him personally, intended to send the man to jail. Once he was safely behind bars, he couldn't stand as president. I mean, this is a blatant effort. That's a blatant attempt to thwart democracy, if you like, to stop a candidate from standing. By the way, this business of democracy, they're all in favor of democracy, these sort of liberal Democrats. Yeah. They're all in favor of, I tell you what they're in favor of. They're in favor of elections as long as their candidate wins.
Yeah.
If that's not the case, if it's a candidate they don't approve, then they're not in favor of it. I'll prove it now. Vance stated this recently, J.B. Vance denounced it. this absolute scandal that's taking place in Romania. Because they didn't like Georgescu as a candidate, they didn't approve. Well, I don't necessarily agree with everything that Georgescu stands for or says. That's beside the point. He's got a right to stand, the same as anybody else. They didn't. He got elected, and what did they do? They cancelled the election. Can you imagine it?
And then they arrested him for the second time.
That's right. Then they've arrested him, and they want to stop him again. They want to stop him from standing as an election again. Now, if this is not a blatant violation of elementary democratic rights, I don't know what is. And that's the way these so-called liberals conduct themselves. And they got the brazen cheek then to accuse Trump of being a threat to democracy, a fascist, in fact. Now, look, they said this before he was elected last time. He was elected in 2016, okay. Now, see, the word fascism is used as an insult. You might just as well call him a son of a bitch or anything else, any other nasty epithet. It's not used as a scientific expression. Now, Marxism is a science. And we Marxists, like any other scientists, we have our own scientific terminology. Fascism is a very precise thing which we define as a specific form of reaction which is based on what? It's a mass movement of the petty bourgeoisie and the lumpen proletariat which is used as a battering ram to smash the working class movement, to smash the trade unions, to illegalize communist and socialist parties and liberal parties also, to destroy democracy, yes, and to institute what? A totalitarian fascist state, which is a strong state, with the secret police, the Gestapo, the concentration camps, and all the rest of it. Okay, now, look, Trump was elected in 2016. Is there anything that he did which bears the slightest resemblance to any of these things? Did he illegalize the trade unions? He did not. Did he take away the right to strike and demonstrate? He did not. Did he illegalize any party? He did not. He didn't even remove people as candidates, which they tried to do against him. It's just a straight lie. No, actually, if you're gonna, if Donald Trump has got any kind of ideology, which is dubious that he does, but if he does have, then he doesn't base himself on Hitler and Mussolini. He bases himself on Roosevelt. Yeah, not F.D. Roosevelt, not Franklin Delany Roosevelt of the 1930s, who invented was responsible for the New Deal. But Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt as he was known, before the First World War. That's his model. Free market capitalism, no taxes or low taxes, and the state, far from a strong state. Trump is not in favor of a strong state. He's in favor of the least possible state intervention, right?
Yeah.
And if possible, I think he would like no state at all. But there we are. That's another matter. But certainly, it's nothing. Whatever else it might be, it's nothing in common with fascism. Another argument that sometimes is heard on the left, is a Bonapartism. Well, Bonapartism is not quite fascism, but it's ruled by the sword. Basically, all Bonapartism ultimately rests upon the police, the army, and the strong state, you know, and ruled by the sword, a military dictatorship, if you like. Okay? Now, again, whatever else you say about Donald Trump, that's not it. It's not it. You might say, well, there's some elements of Bonapartism. That may be the case. I won't argue, but that's kind of splitting hairs, really. I mean, it's possible to find a rough analogy of the Bonapartism in many regimes, like even in Britain under Tony Blair. You had a situation where political power, in effect, passed from Parliament, the British Parliament, the mother of all parliaments. It passed to the cabinet first. Then from the cabinet to a tiny clique of unelected officials, spin doctors, cronies of Blair and so on.
Yeah.
That resembles a kind of parliamentary Bonapartism, yeah. But it's got elements of, yeah, but elements of a phenomenon is not the phenomenon itself. And therefore I think this comparison is more misleading than anything else. It doesn't explain anything. You can say, well, Donald Trump is like this and Donald Trump is like that. I'll tell you what Donald Trump is like. Donald Trump is like Donald Trump. He's quite, I think he's quite a unique phenomenon. But the question which has to be answered is this, which is never posed. How on earth could he defeat all the combined power of the state? Yes. The combined power of the media, of the establishment, of all the newspapers were against him, and all the yet again accused of all sorts of things. They tried to put him in jail. You know, convicted felon. You remember? Convicted. How can you have a convicted felon as a president? Well, you can't, evidently, because he was elected. Elected, furthermore, by a thumping majority, which I didn't expect. I thought he might win the election. I never thought he'd win all of the swing states and win the majority of the popular vote. I didn't think that. Now, but the question must be answered is why? I'll tell you why. And this is something which none of these idiots, the spin doctors, the political experts, and so on, the politologists, they're blind to this. There is a crisis of the capitalist system everywhere. There's a tax upon living standards. In America, by the way, there's been falling living standards now for decades. Yeah. Okay. In many American cities, there are areas which are like third world countries. Appalling areas of deprivation, poverty, and so on and so forth. Okay. And yet, and side by side with the colossal, obscene wealth of the rich, the fat cats, and there's a hatred of the rich, and beneath the surface, in all countries, including America, there is a seething anger, discontent, and above all, I would say frustration, an anger against the rich, an anger against all this injustice and so on and so forth, a burning desire for a change, okay? A hatred of the existing regime and the state and the politicians and the existing parties and so on and so forth, which lacks an expression.
Yeah.
Now, let's come to the point. If the left, if there was such a thing as a genuine left in America, they would undoubtedly be growing now hand over fist rapidly. I'll prove it. Bernie Sanders came from nowhere a few years back and had huge meetings and so on and so forth when he spoke left and put forth some very radical sounding ideas.
He spoke about a political revolution
That's
against
right.
the billionaire class.
That's right. And he did, and he got a response. In fact, Trump, it's not generally realized, but Trump actually said on one occasion that he had said, I've taken some ideas from Bernie Sanders and used them myself. Trump mentions the working class many times. Nobody else did, by the way, or very few people did. Maybe Bernie Sanders, but he was a relatively small phenomenon. Trump is big time.
Trump put it on the agenda.
Trump put the working class firmly on the agenda. Now this, in other words, he gave expression. He gave an expression. He's quite skillful. He's a demagogue, but he's skillful. He gave expression to this enormous field, this rage that exists among millions of people, and that was expressed in this election. That's what none of these people are prepared to recognize. What that election result showed was the colossal discontent with the American people. Now, papers like the disgusting papers, so-called liberal papers like The Guardian in Britain, try to present, he said, what's the reason? Well, the reason is, what they basically say, that the American electors are at fault. It's America's fault. They elected this man because they're organically, in effect, they're organically racist and reactionaries.
Yeah.
And yes, they're prone towards fascism. That's what it boils down to. They're weird. That's what the term was used by an article, a disgusting article, a stupid article in the Guardian. It was a weird result, yes, because the American people are weird. Now, it's the same American people that voted in the past for Obama and for other bourgeois politicians.
Yeah.
Were they weird then? When they voted for Clinton or Obama or any of the others? No. Suddenly they become weird. Now this is just stupidity. Let's say these are explanations which explain nothing except the miserable prejudices of the so-called liberals, who, by the way, they're not liberals at all. They're complete reactionaries, absolute reaction of the worst kind.
Yes, I mean, if we talk about attacks against democratic rights, I don't think anyone has attacked democratic rights more than liberals have. It's kind of like the world upside down.
Yes.
It's like 1984. Every word you hear is
Exactly.
the opposite. When they talk about peacekeepers, they're talking about an attack on Russia.
The Ministry of Peace.
Exactly, and the Ministry of Truth. And they talk about democracy.
Yeah.
In reality, they mean our democracy, our rules. Again, to quote 1980, no, was it Animal Farm? Orwell says we're all equal, but some of us are more equal than others. All our votes count, but some of our votes count for more than others.
Yes.
Of course, this doesn't mean that Trump is the savior of the working class.
Not at all.
But it does explain the hatred that the working class has for the establishment.
Yes.
And now you mentioned the left. Bernie Sanders, his latest exploits is campaigning in defense of the Constitution, in defense of the American Congress, which is ruled by reactionaries, which is a bunch of reactionaries, Republicans as well as Democrats, against Trump's, let's say, fascism, basically. We saw the same thing in Britain with Corbyn. A massive surge around Corbyn.
Yes.
And as you say, the fact that these guys abandoned the stage, it was open for other forces to come to the fore. Now, you hear again from the left that these are far right forces. We talked about this in this program a couple of weeks ago. If we look at the program of reform in Britain, for example, which is an organization that tries to emulate Trumpism in Britain, it actually talks about the nationalization of the utilities. Now, by nationalization, they mean 50% state ownership, 50% pensions, buying up the water companies, the electricity companies, and so on. But that actually puts them to the left of the Labour Party, and it puts them to the left of the Tory Party. But again, here what we see is a surge of anti-establishment hatred against the working class, which is not finding an outlet amongst at the left. What do you think about this idea that calling it Bonapartism, in effect, is a way of supporting the old ruling class, is a way of saying that no, actually, the old liberal ruling class was more progressive somehow. Somehow this is the main. I know that some of the lefts in Britain are now saying, vote anyone but reform. That anyone includes the Tories, the present Labour Party leadership, and everyone else, but just not reform. What do you think the left should do in such a situation? What do you think communists should do in such a situation?
The best thing the so-called left can do is to go home and hide under the bed and pretend that they don't exist. Look, let's call a spade a shovel. Since the crisis of 2008, the capitalist system on a world scale has been in the deepest crisis in its history. It has, and actually, the conditions for socialist revolution, I choose my words carefully, have existed. The objective conditions have existed ever since that time. There was a colossal movement to the left, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
For example, it manifested in different countries. For example, not just Bernie Sanders in the States, but you had Tsipras in Greece, Syriza. You had Podemos in Spain. And above all, you had Jeremy Corbyn in Britain. Now, in every single one of those cases, these lefts, so-called lefts, had a chance. Tsipras, for example, had the whole of the Greek nation, never mind about the working class, even the middle class, even people that voted for the right wing in the past, supported him in his struggle against Brussels, against the attempt to impose austerity on the Greek people. Yes. And he could have led an insurrection, in effect, against Brussels, which could have sparked up a movement throughout Europe. He did not. In the moment of truth, he capitulated, and the whole thing was destroyed. Podemos in Spain, Pablo Iglesias starts with a very left rhetoric, got tremendous support. Then he becomes respectable, joins the Socialist Party in a coalition with the predictable results. And in Britain, that's the most criminal, the most tragic result. Corbyn came from nowhere, same as Sanders came from nowhere, and was propelled into the leadership of the Labour Party on the basis of what? Of a colossal shift to the left. Now, he didn't create that mood. He didn't create that movement. But he acted as a point of reference. That's what was needed.
Yeah.
Like Archimedes, give me a point to stand and I will move the universe. Well, it's the same in politics. There was a colossal mood in favour of a swing to the left. I think 500,000 people joined the Labour Party.
Yes.
In huge numbers, in droves. Now, if Corbyn would have done the same as Trump in the States, and I've used Trump as an example, although he's a reactionary politician, but at least he's got guts. Dare I say he's got a pair of balls, but there we are. I'm old-fashioned. You will excuse me. He had guts then to take on the establishment of the Republican Party. He mobilized his rank and file. He mobilized the base.
Yes.
Trump did. And turned them, unleashed them actually, against the Republican establishment, and that they were terrified. And they had to back off and retreat and accept Trump and his policies. And so on. Corbyn didn't do that. He didn't do what was necessary. It was to carry out a purge, to mobilize his rank and file, to purge the Parliamentary Labour Party of these right-wing gangsters, so-called Labour Tories in disguise, or Liberals at best in disguise. Didn't do that. With the result, he left the door open that they could use, they organised a campaign against him with the assistance of the bourgeois press, the media. By the way, there were articles in the time, in the newspapers, in the bourgeois press, admitting that the ruling class had lost control of the Labour Party, which they had.
Yeah.
Or rather, they ought to have lost control of the Labour Party. They didn't, because Corbyn did not give a clean sweep to these gangsters. He preferred unity with the right wing. Unity,
yeah. The same people who are in power now.
That's right. Now, of course, that gave them a chance. Organised a campaign against him, a smear campaign, using so-called identity politics, which is a reactionary thing, by the way, completely reactionary,
yeah.
Which we're opposed to. Anti-Semitism, you see. The moment they mentioned this, he ran like a rabbit. He was like a rabbit, hypnotized like a rabbit in front of a car.
Yeah.
Hypnotized by the car lights. He was paralyzed with fear. Instead of facing it up, Trump would have faced it down.
Yeah.
He'd have stood up to it, took them head on. The Zionist establishment, the British board of Jews, the Jewish Labour MPs, or whatever they call themselves. He'd have taken them on, who gang of them,
Yeah.
denounced them as right-wingers and purged them. Instead of that, he retreated, and therefore they smashed him. They ended up by expelling him and purging the left. They showed no mercy to the left. The left showed mercy to them. They showed no more mercy to the left whatsoever. And now we're stuck with this gangster, Starmer. The whole thing has changed. Now you see, there's a pattern here. What's the pattern? The whole thing is, the international situation everywhere is characterized by colossal instability, political instability. The centre has collapsed. The centre ground has collapsed. They desperately try to prop it up, but it's collapsed. And there's a polarization to the right and to the left.
Yes.
That's a fact. Now, that reflects ultimately a class polarization in the last analysis. And of course, the workers, the public, the workers are testing the existing parties and leaders. One by one, they put them to the test. They found they failed, they discard them, and they look elsewhere. And therefore, you get constant swings. You will get constant swings. To the left, yes, and also to the right.
Yeah.
To the degree that the left failed, and they failed miserably everywhere, it prepared the way for inevitably a shift to the right. Now, what Trump is offering the working class is an illusion. He wants to put the clock back to the days of Teddy Roosevelt,
Yes.
before the First World War. Yeah, but that was a different historical period. When capitalism was still in an expansionary phase, America was a young, thrusting young power. Okay, now it's different. Now the United States is in difficulties on an international scale. It finds itself confronted with the rising power of China and Russia. It's compelled to retreat. That's the meaning of Trump's attitude towards Europe.
Yes.
He wants to retreat from Europe because he's got other fish to fry. In the Middle East and above all in relation to China. That's his but he's promising. And by the way, he's a master of hyperbole, isn't he?
Oh yeah.
Everything that he promises is marvelous, wonderful, great, fantastic, enormous. And therefore colossal illusions have been built up.
Yeah.
Colossal illusions. People believe this. Because they want to believe it. They want something to believe in. They think they can believe in something. Of course, it will lead nowhere. Ultimately, it's a reactionary utopia that he's promising them. It cannot succeed.
Yes.
The tariffs will not succeed. None of his policies will succeed. And ultimately, there will be, the contradictions will emerge. Now, not immediately. The bourgeois, the liberals, the Democrats are hoping that there will be an economic crisis in the States, which is quite likely by the end of the year. It's quite possible.
Yes.
And that this will lead to a collapse of the Trump's movement. It will not. Why? Because, it's an old famous expression. Hope springs eternal in the human breast.
Yes.
Enormous illusions and hopes have been built up among millions of people. It's almost like a religion. You listen to some of these people